6 weeks into a marriage contracted out of necessity, Sebastian Voss, Duke of Aldrich, stood at the edge of a crowded ballroom and understood, for the first time, that he had made a decision he could not explain to himself. The candles burned in their dozens overhead, throwing warm light across the shoulders of people who watched each other with the careful attention of those who are always being watched in return. The music was bright and precise, the kind that fills a room without warming it. Sebastian had arranged all of this, the ball, the flowers, the invitation list. Because a duke's wife required a public introduction, and because 6 weeks of guarded courtesy inside Aldrich House had produced nothing that resembled comfort between them. He had thought a ball might help. He was no longer certain what he had thought. Lady Ophelia Rastrick found him near the card room at 9:30, appearing at his elbow with the particular quiet of someone who has been waiting for an opening. She was wearing pale green and a small, knowing smile, and she spoke in a voice that could not carry more than 3 feet in any direction. "You must be relieved," Ophelia said, "now that the arrangement has had time to settle. Surely it has served its purpose by now. You needn't continue the performance on my account, Sebastian." He turned to look at her. Ophelia had been a reasonable possibility once, a sensible match. Her family had said, his family had said, everyone had said, before Verity Sherborne's situation had required a different kind of solution, quickly, without the luxury of reasonableness. "I have a wife now," Sebastian said. He said it clearly. Not loudly, but clearly, at a volume that 2 matrons passing behind Ophelia's left shoulder caught without difficulty, as he had intended they should. Ophelia's smile did not waver, but her eyes changed. Sebastian turned toward the ballroom doorway. Verity was standing at the edge of the room, on the arm of a man Sebastian had never seen before. The man was lean and watchful, dressed in a coat that had been well made for someone of slightly different proportions, and he was saying something that made Verity laugh. Not the careful, contained expression she wore when speaking to guests she did not know, but a genuine laugh, brief and unguarded, the kind Sebastian had not yet managed to produce in 6 weeks of trying. Sebastian went pale. He was across the room before he had decided to move. He greeted Verity with correct courtesy, because correctness was the one reliable tool he possessed at this moment. "Your Grace," he said, which was how he addressed her in company, though neither of them had quite adjusted to it. "Your Grace?" Verity replied. With a small, composed smile she deployed at social functions. She turned slightly. "May I introduce Mr. Fenn, a professional acquaintance?" "Mr. Fenn," Sebastian said. "Your Grace." Fenn inclined his head. His voice was even and carried no particular regional accent, the deliberate neutrality of a man trained to pass unnoticed. His eyes moved across the room as Sebastian watched him, not taking in the guests, the gowns, the chandeliers, but noting the exits, the clusters, the positions of people near the doors, the way a man reads a room when he is working, not socializing. "What is your profession, Mr. Fenn?" Sebastian asked. "Private inquiry," Fenn said. "Research and documentation, largely." "For whom do you work?" "I'm afraid my arrangements are confidential, Your Grace. You'll understand." Sebastian looked at Verity. Verity met his gaze with an expression that gave him nothing, polite, pleasant, and entirely opaque. "Shall I take you in to supper?" he asked her. "Thank you," Verity said. She offered her hand to Fenn first. "I'll call on you Tuesday, Mr. Fenn, if that suits." "It suits perfectly, ma'am," Fenn said, and moved away into the crowd with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has accomplished what he came to do. Sebastian walked Verity toward the supper table, her hand on his arm, and spoke to her about the guests. who had arrived late, who had brought unexpected relations, whether the cold pheasant had been a wise choice given the temperature in the East Room. He spoke about the flowers and the musicians and the particular difficulty of managing a supper service for 140 people. He spoke about everything, except the question he could feel assembling itself behind his eyes with the precision of a legal document. Who is that man? What has he been researching? And why does he look at a ballroom the way a constable looks at a crime scene? Verity answered his questions about the flowers and the pheasant with the same composed pleasantness she had offered all evening. And if she noticed the shape of what he was not asking, she gave no sign of it. At the supper table, Sebastian handed her a plate of things she had not chosen, and she accepted it without comment, which told him she was not paying attention to the food. She was watching the room. He followed her gaze and found it resting, briefly, on a man standing near the fireplace on the far side of the room. Reginald Price, her cousin guardian, broad-shouldered and smiling with the particular confidence of a man who believes every room he enters is already his. Price was watching them. When he caught Sebastian's eye, he raised his glass in a small, private toast. Sebastian looked away. He said nothing about Price either. He talked about the pheasant until Verity ate some of it. Returning from supper, Sebastian guided Verity past a cluster of guests gathered near the base of the staircase, and positioned himself with the easy casualness of a man adjusting his route so that his shoulder came between Verity and Reginald Price, who had drifted to the edge of the group with his glass still in hand. Price raised it again as they passed. Sebastian did not return the gesture, and did not slow his pace, and did not look back to see whether Price noticed. Outside, the night was cold and clear. The carriage stood at the gate, the horse's breath rising in small clouds. Sebastian opened the door for Verity and followed her in, and as the carriage moved into the street, he shrugged off his greatcoat and settled it over her shoulders without asking. She was wearing something thin and pale blue that was entirely unsuited to November, and she had not brought a wrap, and he had noticed this 2 hours ago and said nothing because she had not asked for his opinion on her clothing. She accepted the coat with a quiet, "Thank you," and pulled it around herself. And Sebastian angled his body toward the window, watching the street. 2 men stood at the gate as they passed, not servants, not guests, not anyone he recognized. They were watching the carriage with the particular stillness of men paid to note rather than act. Sebastian filed this and said nothing about it. Inside Aldrich House, in the hallway, with the footmen dismissed and the house quiet around them, he asked her, "Where did you meet Mr. Fenn?" Verity handed the greatcoat to the hall table and turned to face him. She looked tired, not the social tiredness of a long evening, but the deeper tiredness of someone who has been managing something difficult for much longer than one night. "He was recommended to me," she said. "By whom?" "By someone who had used his services and found them reliable." "What is the private matter he's assisting with?" Verity looked at him steadily. "I will explain it when there is more to explain, when the work is further along." "Is it connected to your brother?" Sebastian asked. The question landed in the space between them. Something shifted in Verity's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "Good night, Sebastian," she said. She went upstairs. Her footsteps were even and unhurried on the stairs, and the sound of them faded into the upper hallway. And then there was silence. Sebastian stood in the entrance hall with his question still in his hand, turning it over, and found that he had no place to put it down. The following morning, Sebastian sent a note to Verity's sitting room before breakfast. "Would you come to the study when you are free? There is a matter I need to discuss with you." He did not sign it with anything warmer than his initial, because he had not yet established what warmth was appropriate between them. And he had not asked. She came at 10 o'clock, dressed plainly, her hair done without ornament. She took the chair across from his desk without being invited to sit, which told him she had decided on her approach before she arrived. Sebastian placed a single sheet of paper on the desk between them and folded his hands. Price's solicitor, he said, was seen leaving an office in Chancery Lane 3 days ago. The office belongs to Mr. Fenn. He paused. If Fenn is working on something that touches Price's affairs, I need to know what it is. Not out of curiosity. Because Price is not a man who allows people to work against his interests without responding to it. Verity looked at the paper on the desk. Then she looked at him. How do you know where Fenn's office is? She asked. I had him looked into last night, after we returned home. Something moved across her face. Not anger, not yet. More like the expression of someone who has confirmed a suspicion they had hoped was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Close the door. Sebastian rose, closed the study door, and returned to his chair. Verity set her hands flat on the desk. Fenn is Bow Street trained. He left the runners 4 years ago and has worked privately since then. I hired him 6 weeks ago, the week before our wedding, with money from my own savings. He has been gathering documentary proof that Reginald Price has been systematically redirecting funds from Simon's inheritance. Embezzlement spread across a series of debts and transfers designed to look like legitimate management. Fenn has been building the paper trail for 6 weeks, and he is close to having enough to bring a formal challenge to Price's fitness as guardian. Sebastian was very still. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, Verity confirmed. He looked at his folded hands. You hired him the week before our wedding. Yes, before we had spoken more than twice. The wedding was the legal protection, Verity said, not unkindly. Your title gives Simon a male protector, whose standing Price cannot easily dismiss. Fenn's evidence gives us the grounds to challenge the guardianship directly. I needed both. I could only ask you for one of them. Sebastian absorbed this. Then he said, Price's solicitor was at Fenn's office. I know. Fenn told me yesterday. It means Price suspects something, though he cannot yet know how much Fenn has documented. She paused. And now I have a question for you. Yes. Price's solicitor, Verity said, mentioned to Fenn, in passing, as men sometimes do when they believe they are speaking to someone on their own side, that the Duke of Aldrich has been purchasing Reginald Price's outstanding gambling debts, quietly, through intermediaries, for approximately a month, beginning 2 weeks after our wedding. She held his gaze. Why has your name appeared in Price's financial affairs without a word to me? The silence in the study was complete. I meant to present it to you when it was finished, Sebastian said. When it was finished. When I had enough of the debts to use as leverage, to force Price to withdraw the petition without a public fight. I thought. He stopped. I thought if I could resolve it before it became a crisis, you would not have to... What? Verity asked. Her voice was quiet and very precise. What would I not have to do, Sebastian? What have you been sparing me? He had no clean answer. He knew it as he opened his mouth and found nothing there that did not sound, in the saying, like exactly what it was. A man who had decided his wife needed protecting from the ugliness of her own situation, without asking her whether she agreed. I was wrong not to tell you, he said. Verity looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, What am I to you in this house, if not someone you fight beside? The The question sat between them on the desk beside the paper with Fenn's address on it. Sebastian did not answer it. He did not have an answer that was honest and also adequate. What he said finally was, "We should stop working separately." "Yes," Verity said. "We should." Neither of them said anything further. They sat across the desk from each other in the quiet morning, and neither of them fully trusted that the other would hold to it, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said that either. Over the following week, Sebastian and Verity met with Fenn twice in his office in Chancery Lane, a cramped, paper-stacked room on the second floor of a building that smelled of ink and coal smoke, reached by a staircase narrow enough that Sebastian had to turn sideways on the landing. There was one spare chair. Sebastian gave it to Verity both times and stood with his back to the bookcase, which left him eye level with a shelf of ledgers and Fenn's collection of annotated court records. Fenn laid out the evidence with the methodical patience of a man who understood that his audience needed to see the whole picture before any single piece of it would make sense. Price had redirected funds from Simon's inheritance across a series of transactions, some disguised as estate management fees, some buried inside gambling debts that Price himself had then arranged to have called in against the Sherborne estate. The sum was not enormous by aristocratic standards. By the standards of a 16-year-old boy's future, it was considerable. Several of the debts, Fenn said, spreading papers across the one clear surface of his desk, are no longer held by their original creditors. They were purchased in the last month by a third party. He glanced at Sebastian without expression. "By me," Sebastian said. He reached inside his coat and produced the debt vouchers, a neat bundle tied with a narrow strip of legal tape, and placed them on Fenn's desk beside the investigator's own papers. "I approached the creditors individually. Here are the dates and the amounts." He spread them flat. "This one first, because it was the largest, and I wasn't certain the others would cooperate. Then these three in the same week." Fenn took up his pen and began marking each voucher against his own ledger, noting the dates, the creditors' names, the amounts. He worked without a word. Verity watched the process with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving between the vouchers and Fenn's marks on the page, reading as he recorded. "The total," Fenn said without looking up, "gives the Duke of Aldrich effective control over approximately 2/3 of Price's outstanding obligations. Used correctly, that is sufficient to make Price's financial position untenable if he refuses to withdraw the petition." "Yes," Sebastian said. "And combined with the documentary evidence of the embezzlement," Fenn continued, "it gives us two separate lines of pressure: legal challenge to his fitness and direct financial leverage." He set down his pen. "The question is the order in which we deploy them." They visited the Sherborne family solicitor the following afternoon, a careful gray-haired man named Aldous Croft, who had handled the Sherborne estate papers since Verity's father's time, and who greeted Verity with the particular warmth of someone who had watched her manage an impossible situation with inadequate resources for 2 years. He spread the guardianship documents across his table and walked them through the structure of Price's claim. "The petition rests on 2 facts," Croft said. "Simon's age, he is 16, not yet of age to act for himself, and his lack of a male protector of sufficient standing to contest the guardianship in court." He glanced at Sebastian. "The second of those facts has changed. The first has not. But if Price's fitness as guardian can be formally challenged, if the documentary evidence of financial misconduct is presented to a magistrate before the petition is heard, the petition itself loses its foundation. A guardian shown to have embezzled from his ward's estate has no standing to petition for expanded custody." "How long do we have?" Verity asked. Price's petition is scheduled for hearing in 6 weeks, Croft said. Fenn's evidence, assembled into a proper documentary brief, needs perhaps 3 weeks to be ready. That is manageable. What is not manageable is any acceleration of the timeline. If Price were to move his petition forward for any reason, the brief might not be ready. What would cause him to move it forward? Sebastian asked. Croft looked at him steadily. If he discovered the investigation, or if he believed he was about to lose his financial position. Sebastian and Verity did not look at each other. Walking back to the carriage after the second meeting with Fenn, 3 days later, the afternoon light was thin and cold, the street quiet at this hour. Verity walked with her hands inside her muff and her eyes on the pavement. And Sebastian walked beside her with his hands behind his back in the way he did when he was thinking through something he had not yet resolved. My father taught me to read a legal instrument before I could read a novel, Verity said. He said a woman who can read a contract is harder to cheat than one who cannot. Sebastian turned to look at her. He was right. He was. She was quiet for a moment. I could have told you that, in the first week. I wish I had known it, Sebastian said. It was the first thing either of them had said to each other that was not, in some way, about Price. The carriage was 20 feet ahead. They walked the remaining distance without speaking, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones they had been sharing. Less like a wall, and more like a room with the window left open. A storm came in from the north on a Thursday afternoon, while Sebastian and Verity were walking the grounds at Aldrich Park with the family solicitor's notes in hand. Verity reading aloud from the brief Croft had drafted, Sebastian listening and occasionally asking her to repeat a passage so he could consider it against what he knew of Price's creditors. The sky had been gray all morning. By 2 o'clock it had darkened to something more serious, and the first real gust came across the open lawn with enough force to scatter the top pages from Verity's hand before she could close the folder. Sebastian caught 2 of them. Verity caught the third and pressed the folder shut against her chest. The folly, Sebastian said. And they moved toward it at something between a walk and a run as the rain began in earnest. The garden folly was a single open room of pale stone, built against the garden wall with an arched entrance that faced south, which meant the north wind drove the rain sideways through the arch in sheets. They stood inside it, pressed toward the back wall, and the sound of the rain on the stone was loud enough that they had to stand closer together than they would have otherwise in order to speak without shouting. Verity had her back to the wall, and the folder pressed against her front, and the wind had found her hair. A pin pulled loose and fell somewhere into the folds of her coat, and she reached for it with one hand while keeping the folder secured with the other. Sebastian saw it go. He reached before she did and caught the pin between 2 fingers. He stepped closer and tucked it back at her temple, pressing it into place. And his hand stayed a moment longer than the task required, his fingers at her hairline, the rain loud around them. Verity went still. He stepped back. The distance between them was restored. They stood apart and watched the rain come through the arch and gray curtains, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Simon is afraid, Verity said finally. He said so in his last letter. He's afraid Price will move before we're ready, and that he'll be sent north to some distant relation's house before any of this is resolved. She paused. He's 16. He tries to sound practical in his letters, but I know when he's frightened. He will not be sent north, Sebastian said. Verity looked at him. How can you be certain? Sebastian was quiet. The rain came sideways through the arch, and the stone floor darkened in patches where it reached. I can't, he said after a moment. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the arch, at the rain. 2 years ago, I backed a friend's shipping venture. A man I had known since we were boys, a good man, a careful man, who had researched the route and the cargo and the partners for 2 years before he asked me to invest. Every piece of advice I received told me not to do it. My solicitor, my estate manager, 2 men whose judgment I had relied on for a decade, all of them said no. I said yes, because I believed in my friend's judgment when no one else did. He stopped. What happened? Verity asked. The venture failed. There was a storm off the Portuguese coast, the kind of thing no one could have predicted and no one could have prevented. The ship was lost. My friend had invested everything he had. He was ruined inside a year. Sebastian turned the folder he had been holding over in his hands. I don't know whether my backing made the difference. I don't know whether he would have gone forward without me. But he went forward with me, and he was ruined. And I have not been certain of my own judgment since, on anything that matters. Verity was quiet for a long moment. The rain began to slow, not stopping but easing, the curtain through the arch thinning from a wall to a veil. Was he ruined because you believed in him? She asked. He was ruined because the ship sank, Sebastian said. Yes, Verity said simply. He was. Sebastian looked at her. She was watching the rain with the particular stillness of someone who has said what she meant and is waiting to see whether it lands. They walked back to the house when the rain had slowed enough to permit it, closer together than they had walked out, not touching, but the distance between them altered in quality from what it had been an hour before. The sealed letter from Price's solicitor arrived at Aldrich Park on a Tuesday morning, addressed to Verity. Sebastian was in the estate office when it was brought to him by mistake. Same address, similar hand on the envelope, the footman uncertain. And he read it before he understood what he was holding. Price had filed an emergency petition. New evidence of domestic instability in the Aldrich household, the letter claimed, without specifying what the evidence was. He was seeking Simon's immediate removal from Verity's care and placement with a distant relation in Northumberland. The petition was to be heard within the week. Sebastian read it twice. He read the phrase, domestic instability, twice more, and felt something settle in him that was cold and very clear. He folded the letter. He did not go to find Verity. He sent a note to his man in London and ordered his horse saddled, and he rode to the city that afternoon. Price's primary creditor, a man named Hartwell, who held the 2 largest outstanding vowels and who had been resistant to Sebastian's earlier approach, kept an office near the Strand. Sebastian arrived at 3:30 and was shown in immediately, because a duke is shown in immediately regardless of the hour. He was in the middle of explaining the terms of his proposal. The debts purchased outright, a significant sum above their face value, in exchange for Hartwell's cooperation in presenting them as leverage against Price's continued pursuit of the petition. When the door opened, Fenn stood in the doorway. He looked at Sebastian with the even, unsurprised expression of a man who has followed 3 people to the same location and is not astonished to find them all there. "Your Grace," Fenn said. Sebastian stood up. Fenn said, "I've sent word to Aldrich Park, to Her Grace." Sebastian was very still. "When?" "An hour ago. I've been watching Price's movement since the petition was filed this morning. I saw Hartwell's man leave Price's club, and I followed him here. When I arrived and found your horse outside." Fenn paused. "I thought Her Grace should know." Sebastian looked at Hartwell, who had the expression of a man who has suddenly realized he is involved in something larger than he agreed to. Sebastian gathered his papers and his hat and left the office without completing the negotiation. He rode back to Aldrich Park and arrived as the light was failing. Verity was standing in the entrance hall. She was holding the letter. She had been holding it long enough that the fold had softened in her hands. "Did you go to London today?" she asked. "Yes." "To Hartwell?" "Yes." "To threaten Price with the debts," Verity said, "without telling me the letter had arrived, without telling me what you were doing, so that it would be resolved before I knew there was a crisis." "I thought—" "I know what you thought," Verity said. She set the letter down on the hall table with a care that was more frightening than force. "I have been managing crises alone for 2 years, Sebastian. I know how to do it. What I do not know how to do is manage a crisis when the person who should be beside me has decided, again, that I am better served by not knowing." "I was trying to protect Simon," Sebastian said. "You were trying to protect yourself," Verity said. "From being wrong, from making a decision in front of me that might not work." She looked at him steadily. "I would like you to go to London. I need to think, and I cannot do it with you in the house." Sebastian went. He stayed at Aldrich House in London for 4 days. He did not write. He sat in his study and looked at the papers he had accumulated, the debt vouchers, the creditor correspondence, the notes from Croft's office, and found that without Verity across a desk from him, reading alongside him, the papers were just paper. At Aldrich Park, Verity worked with Fenn through 4 consecutive evenings, assembling the formal response to the emergency petition. The response was complex. It needed to address the claim of domestic instability, while simultaneously presenting enough of Fenn's documentary evidence to cast doubt on Price's fitness as the petitioner. Verity drafted it in longhand, revising each section until it was precise enough to satisfy Croft and plain enough to be understood by a magistrate reading quickly. On the 4th night, she was at her desk at 3 a.m. when she heard the sound of a carriage on the gravel below the window. She did not go to the window. She kept writing. The footsteps on the stairs were Sebastian's. She had learned the weight of them in 6 weeks of shared house. He opened the study door without knocking, which he had never done before, and stood in the doorway looking at her. She was cold. She had not noticed it until she stopped writing to look at him. And then she noticed that her hands were very cold, and had been for some time, and that the fire had burned down to almost nothing. Sebastian crossed the room without speaking. He pulled the other chair close to hers and sat down beside her. He took her hands between his and held them, both hands, his larger ones wrapped around hers, and said nothing. She looked at the page in front of her. She picked up her pen. Her hands, between his, grew steady after a few minutes, and she kept writing. Neither of them acknowledged this in the morning. Sebastian remained at Aldrich Park. They did not discuss Price or Simon or the debt vouchers. They ate breakfast at the same table and spoke about the weather and the state of the kitchen garden, and it was the most careful conversation they had ever had. 3 days later, a magistrate's clerk sent Fenn a private warning. Price had found a witness, a former servant, recently dismissed from Aldrich House under circumstances that Price had clearly chosen carefully, who would testify that the Duchess's household was disordered, her management erratic, her judgment unsuitable for the care of a young person. The testimony was purchased. Fenn was certain of it. But certainty and proof were different things, and without proof, the testimony would stand. The clerk's warning was specific. Without a duke standing to formally counter the bribed testimony in the room where it was given, the custody hearing might go to Price regardless of Fenn's documentary evidence. The evidence could prove embezzlement. It could not by itself overcome a witness sworn before a magistrate. Fenn came to Aldrich Park that afternoon and told Verity. Verity sat at her desk for a long time after Fenn left. Then she took a sheet of paper and wrote 4 words. She sent it to London by the fastest writer in the stables. Come back. Bring everything. Sebastian arrived the same evening, before dinner. He came directly to the study, still in his riding coat, and placed the full accounting on the desk between them without preamble. Every debt voucher, sorted by date, every creditor's name written clearly at the top of each page. The record of every purchase in the order in which he had made them. The dates were visible. They began 2 weeks after the wedding. Verity sat across from him and read through the entire account without speaking. She read each page with the careful attention her father had taught her, not skimming for the total, but reading the structure, the sequence, the pattern of decisions that the dates revealed. She read for 20 minutes while Sebastian sat across from her and did not speak and did not move. When she finished, she set the last page down. "I'm not angry," she said. "You have every right to be." "I know I do." She looked at the papers on the desk. "I'm tired, Sebastian. I'm tired of being protected instead of trusted. I understand that what you did came from..." She stopped. "It came from somewhere genuine. I know that. But protection without information is a kind of control, however kindly it's meant. You made decisions about my fight without telling me. You decided what I needed to know and what I could be spared. And you made those decisions alone, because you didn't trust your own judgment enough to share it with me." She paused. "So you made it worse by hiding it?" "Yes," Sebastian said. "What would it look like?" Verity asked. "If you trusted me?" He looked at her across the desk, the papers between them, the candles burning low, the house quiet around them. He opened his mouth to answer. Verity stood up and crossed the distance between their chairs and kissed him. He went very still. For a moment he did not move at all. Then his hand came up to her face, careful and deliberate, and he kissed her back, not urgently, but with the particular attention of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time, and is now being given permission to stop thinking. They pulled apart. The candles were the same height. The papers were still on the desk. Neither of them said anything. Sebastian reached for the top page of the account. "This one," he said, and his voice was slightly different in register from the way it had been before, steadier and less careful, as though something that had been held at a controlled tension had been set down. "This is the first creditor I approached, a man named Gresham, who held the largest single vowel. I went to him because I thought if he agreed, the others would follow." He set the page between them and pointed to the date. "Here's when I went. Here's what I paid. And here's what it means for Price if we present it at the hearing." Verity sat back down. She pulled the page toward her and took up her pen. "Go on," she said, and began to take notes. The second Aldrich ball was held 6 weeks after the first, on a night when the frost had come early and the windows of Aldrich House were bright against the dark street. The guests arrived in the same carriages, wore the same jewels, arranged themselves in the same clusters near the same walls, and watched each other with the same careful attention. The ballroom was everything a ballroom was required to be. Warm, bright, crowded, loud with music and the particular noise of 100 well-dressed people performing ease. Reginald Price arrived at 9 o'clock with his solicitor at his elbow and the expression of a man who has arranged the evening to his own satisfaction. He moved through the room with the patience of someone who is waiting for the right moment, speaking to guests, accepting wine, positioning himself near the center of the floor where he could be seen and heard from every corner. At 9:30, when the music paused between dances and the room was full and briefly still, Price reached into his coat and produced a document. His solicitor stepped half a pace back, as men do when they want to be visible without being accountable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Price said, at a volume that carried without effort, "I apologize for the interruption to the evening. I am afraid a matter of some urgency requires a moment of the room's attention. He began to read. The custody petition, formal and elaborate, full of legal language designed to sound conclusive to those who could not read it carefully. He read the first paragraph in full. The claim of instability, the concern for the minor's welfare, the request for immediate placement with a suitable relation. And he was 3 sentences into the second paragraph when Sebastian stepped forward. He did not move quickly. He crossed the floor with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided exactly where he is going and sees no reason to hurry because nothing about his arrival is in doubt. The room watched him. Price watched him. His solicitor's expression shifted. Sebastian stopped. He did not speak to Price. He turned to face Verity, who stood 6 feet away at the edge of the room, and he held out the bound bundle of Price's gambling debts, every voucher, the full account, tied with the same strip of legal tape. The room was very quiet. "I bought these," Sebastian said clearly, so that every person in the room could hear him without straining. "Over the course of a month, beginning 2 weeks after our wedding, through intermediaries, without a word to my wife. I had enough of them, by the end, to ruin Price's financial position outright. To call in every obligation at once and leave him nothing to fight with." He paused. I didn't tell Verity because 2 years ago my judgment cost a man his livelihood, and since then I have not trusted it enough to share it before it was already proven right. So I solved her problems in secret. I made decisions about her brother's future without giving her the information she needed to make them herself. He looked at her steadily. "That ends tonight." He held out the bundle. "Whatever is decided about Price," Sebastian said, "will be decided by you, not for you." The room did not breathe. Verity crossed the floor and took the bundle from his hands. She turned to face the room. She looked at Price, who had not moved, whose expression had shifted from confidence through surprise, and was now settling somewhere colder and more calculating. She looked at his solicitor. She looked at the guests, the matrons and the magistrates, and the men of business and the women who had watched her for 6 weeks to determine what kind of duchess she intended to be. She held up Price's petition. "This is what my cousin has filed," she said. Her voice was level and clear, the voice of a woman who has read legal instruments since childhood and is not afraid of them. "I will read it to you." She read every clause. She read the claim of domestic instability and the language about the minor's welfare and the assertion of Price's fitness as guardian. She read it with the careful precision of someone who wants the room to understand exactly what is being claimed and exactly how it is constructed. Then she reached into the pocket of her gown and produced Fenn's brief 20 pages of documented evidence, assembled over 6 weeks, organized by date and transaction. "And this," she said, "is what my cousin has done with my brother's inheritance." She read the first transaction. She read the second. She read the amounts and the dates and the creditors' names and the method by which the funds had been redirected. And she read them in the same clear, unhurried voice. And the room listened with the absolute attention of people who are watching something they will describe for the rest of their lives. Halfway through the 4th transaction, she stopped. She turned to her left, where Sir Edmund Caro stood with a glass of champagne and the expression of a man who has been a magistrate for 20 years and recognizes the shape of what he is hearing. "Sir Edmund," Verity said, "you have now heard the petition and the evidence that contradicts it. I am asking you to act on what you've heard tonight." Sir Edmund set down his champagne glass. He said, "Mrs. Fenn, that is, the investigator, is he present?" "He is outside," Verity said. "He has been waiting." "Fetch him in," Sir Edmund said. He turned to Price. Price's solicitor had taken 2 steps backward. Price himself had not moved, but the confidence had left his face entirely, replaced by the particular blankness of a man calculating how much he has already lost. "Mr. Price," Sir Edmund said, in the tone magistrates use when the verdict is already decided and the formality is a courtesy, "I think you had better come with me." 2 of Sebastian's footmen, large, steady men who had been positioned near the doors since 7 o'clock that evening, moved forward. Price's solicitor began to speak and then stopped. Price looked around the room once, at the faces of people who had known him for 30 years and were looking back at him with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to cold relief. He straightened his coat with the dignity of a man who has no dignity left to straighten and walked toward the door. The next dance was called 8 minutes later. The musicians, who had been watching from the gallery with the fascinated attention of people who know a good story when they see one, struck up with rather more enthusiasm than the evening had previously required. Later that night, in the study at Aldrich House, Verity and Sebastian sat on opposite sides of the desk with the custody transfer documents spread between them and 2 witnesses, Croft, the family solicitor, and Fenn, who had come in from the cold and accepted a glass of something warm, standing at the edge of the room. Verity read through each page before she signed. Sebastian watched her read. When she reached the last page, she looked up at him. "He'll have a room of his own," she said. "Simon, the one at the end of the east corridor. He said once that he liked the view." "He can have whichever room he likes," Sebastian said. She signed. Sebastian signed beside her. Croft witnessed and Fenn witnessed, and Croft gathered the papers and tied them with practiced efficiency and put them in his case. And Fenn finished his drink and took his coat and said good night with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has completed a job he was hired to do. Sebastian extinguished the lamp. The room went dark except for the last of the fire, which was very low, and the light from the street coming through the curtains, and the particular quiet of a house at midnight when the work is finished. Morning came gray and mild, with frost on the garden and pale light through the east windows. Simon's trunk was already on the landing when Verity came downstairs. 3 of the footmen were carrying it up the last flight of stairs to the room at the end of the east corridor, the one with the view over the garden, negotiating the corner with the careful concentration of men who have been told not to scratch the woodwork. In the small sitting room off the kitchen, where the household ate breakfast informally on ordinary mornings, there was 1 tray on the table. On it were 2 cups of tea, already poured. Sebastian was reading a letter from his solicitor at the window. He set it down when Verity came in and pushed one of the cups toward her side of the table. She sat down. She picked up the cup. Outside on the landing, she could hear the footman negotiating the trunk around the final corner, and Simon's voice, bright, unguarded, already at home, asking if he could put his books on the window seat or whether there was a proper shelf. "There's a proper shelf," one of the footmen said. "But the window seat's better." Verity looked at Sebastian over the rim of her cup. He was watching the doorway, listening to the sound of the trunk being set down above them, the sound of a 16-year-old boy walking across his own floor for the first time. The study door at the end of the hall stood open, the morning light coming straight through it onto the corridor floor. Something that only happened when both the east window and the door were aligned just so, which Sebastian had noticed once, weeks ago, and not mentioned, because he had not yet found the right moment. He looked at Verity. She was still watching him. "Tea's going cold," she said. "Yes," he said, and drank his.